Okay.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to digital Zoom space that we have here. Um, so we're going to get started in a second, but I want to actually start off by warming us up with a couple of things. First, I want to start by saying that happy Friday to everyone. It says an afternoon with An Duplan, but on the East Coast, it's actually the evening. So for all of you who are entering into your evening, welcome to your evening. And thank you for joining us during this Friday, for sharing your time and your space with us. What we're going to do in terms of the organizational structure for this conversation, we'll start by allowing An to share his work. Then we'll hear from Eileen and her work, and then we'll gather together for a bit of conversation before turning to questions from other folks in the Zoom space. But before we do that, I think it's important that we introduce the folk who are in this room, right? So let's go ahead and do that. I'll start with our speaker for today, Anis Duplan. An is a trans poet, curator, and artist. He is the author of a book of essays, Blackspace, on the Poetics of an Afrofuture, a full-length poetry collection, Take the Stallion, and a chapbook, Mount Carmel and the Blood of Parnassus. He has taught poetry at the University of Iowa, Columbia University, Sarah Lawrence College, and St. Joseph's College. His video works have been exhibited by Flux Factory, Data Editions, and the 13th Baltic Triennial in Lithuania, Matthew Gallery, Newhouse, the Paseo Project, and will be exhibited at the Institute of Contemporary Art in LA in 2021. As an independent curator, he has facilitated curatorial projects in Chicago, Boston, Santa Fe, and Reykjavik. He was a 2017 to 2019 Joint Public Programs Fellow at the Museum of Modern Art and the Studio Museum in Harlem. In 2016, he founded the Center for Afrofuturist Studies, an artist residency program for artists of color based at Iowa City's artist-run organization, Public Space One. He works as the program manager at Recess. Next, I'd love to introduce Aileen Isagan. Aileen was born in Manila, Philippines, and raised in Tampa, Florida. An artist, writer, and curator, she has worked with contemporary art and nonprofit arts organizations, including David Zwirner, the Whitney Museum, Rhizome at the New Museum, Frame Contemporary Art, Finland, the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, and the Museum of Digital Art. Her moving image work has been exhibited at the US, UK, France, Italy, the Netherlands, and Mexico. Her first book, Vanishing Acts, was published by Link Editions, and she has performed at American Medium, Downs and Ross, Housing Works Books, and Shoot the Lobster, among others. Skyers holds a BA in philosophy and a BFA in studio art from the University of South Florida, and an MA in critical studies at Pacific Northwest College of Art. She currently lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. So my name's Clay. I am an educator, a writer, and a patternist. I teach at CGU and at the University of Pennsylvania, where I also serve as an associate director of instructional design for Penn's College of Liberal and Professional Studies. My work embraces the notion that lifelong learning is integral to any sustainable social system. And I believe that Black futures offer ways of learning, imagining, and becoming that can help us get free. Over the years, I've written and taught at the intersection of Black studies, queer studies, science fiction studies, and digital pedagogy, following an impulse towards reparative world-building work that weds critical play with pedagogical praxis. So thank you, Aileen and An, for being in this space. I also want to thank all the rest of you in the audience. I want to thank Laura Black and Sunny Chow and Daryl Moore. In terms of getting started, before we do that, I want to kind of continue that thanks to more specifics. So Daryl Moore helped conceptualize and organize this event, which is part of the larger Bradshaw Conference series that's organized around Futurity and Future Publics this year. I also want to thank Dr. Eve Oishi, that chair of the Cultural Studies Department here at CGU, was also offered guidance and support. I want to thank Eileen Kim, Laura Black again, and Catherine Rutz, who helped organize and create the digital space for this event, including the website. Many of you may have navigated to get to this Zoom room. Speaking of the website, you may have also noticed that in addition to the Zoom link, it contains a curated playlist and a bibliography. We hope that these materials might follow you into the weekend and further into the future. Speaking of the weekend, I tried to include some choice bops in the playlist precisely for that purpose. So hopefully that can help you get to the weekend a little bit better too. Lastly, before we get started, I want to acknowledge that it's totally fine with me and hopefully with our other participants if you all emote in the Zoom chat. If we imagine that this is a potential future artifact, I'd like to think that the viewers and listeners in the great beyond in the future might find comfort in that emoting, just as I do now. Also, it's Friday, and we made it through another week, which I consider a delightfully mundane triumph. I don't know about you, but for me, emoting helps me get through, if emoting is your thing. So with that long warm up, I want to kind of share this space now with An. Does that sound okay, An? Cool.
Thank you for that intro, Clayton. And I'm excited for this evening, not least because I'm a huge fan of Aileen's, and this isn't the first time that we have been part of an event before. So I run an artist residency program called the Center for Afrofuture Studies, and we invited Aileen to come out to Iowa, which is where the CAS is, to take part in an event called Black Curators Roundtable, where we were sort of thinking about the different challenges and opportunities faced by Black curators at different points of relationship to the institution. Small institutions, big institutions, not part of the institution. And it was a very well attended event and led into a really nice kind of after party thing. And so glad for the opportunity to stay in conversation. I was telling Daryl that I currently have COVID-19. And so one, I'm very tired, so just bear with me if I'm speaking very slowly. And two, I'm at like a quarantine hotel at the moment, and there are these wellness checks that happen. So, and I don't know when they happen. So someone might knock on my door to make sure that I'm okay. But I'm grateful to be with y'all today. I canceled an event I had yesterday, but I was like, I gotta do this one. So what you're seeing on the screen, and just let me know verbally if you can't hear me or if you can't see what's on my screen. I think the hotel Wi-Fi isn't the greatest, but what you're seeing is slides from a collage that I made from Thank you. Slides from a collage that I made with pages from Blackspace and an image archive that I've been building. A lot of the impetus for Blackspace was looking at work by and images of Black people. And I've become very interested in the sort of transition from text to image and then back image to text, and kind of thinking about what gets transmuted each of those directions. But sort of set you up for the kind of basic project of Blackspace. You can see over on the right, this is the very first page, and these three questions: has my life been predestined? Can I pursue liberation? What kind of liberation can I pursue? Were the kind of launching or guiding questions for me. In particular, I wanted to think about what this word liberation means through three lenses, one being through the lens of the self. So, for example, thinking about psychic liberation, there's a lot of pop self-help literature that's written with a mind to helping people to kind of pursue the best versions of themselves. I love self-help literature, so I'm saying this with a lot of love. I was just watching a Brene Brown documentary earlier. But so the idea that like you as an individual person have a kind of fully realized form, and that there's, largely a sort of psychological journey that you can go through to become sort of fully realized. And then there's the social frame of liberation. So we talk about this a lot as a culture at the moment. So thinking about liberation for everyone in my particular subject group, Black people, trans people, et cetera, right? So only individual insofar as I belong to those groups. And you can think of the phrase, none of us are free until all of us is free, right? So fairly easy to understand that one. And then there's a sort of final form of liberation that often comes up either in philosophical literature or oftentimes like religious or spiritual literature. You can think of words like nirvana or enlightenment. It's a sort of freedom that is not personal, right? It's not about me it's not about the groups that I belong to. It's about a sort of more existential kind of liberation. And so I was interested in kind of thinking about all three of those because I had read a lot of literature that was like one of them at a time, maybe two at a time, but never really kind of engaging these three ways that I had kind of seen liberation talked about. And lastly, I think the qualifier for Blackspace would be that I was specifically wanting to think about Black artists living and no longer living. Blackspace was sort of the first time that my externally facing practices, so music journalism, arts administration, cultural criticism, came together with my sort of more solo practices of poetry and video. One of the most influential conversations for me that came up in the course of writing Blackspace was with Nathaniel Mackey, who talks about the way that self and sound are analogous, meaning that Audre Lorde also has a similar idea to this in Poetry is Not a Luxury, right? That through creativity, one can go through a process of self-discovery. And I think for me, creativity was important because there's a link between creativity in all three of the forms of liberation that I mentioned, right? So creativity as a way of self-discovery. You could think of like art therapy and the capacity for art to kind of open certain psychological channels. You can think about jazz and other sort of artistic movements that have had cultural impact, Afrofuturism, obviously. And then you can also think of, right, like the many artists have a sort of spiritual connection with their work. Certainly there are jazz musicians who talk about this quite a bit. Creativity as a way of transcending the physical form, et cetera, et cetera. So creativity becomes a way of kind of unlocking these three modes. So one idea that as I kind of started this research journey became very important was that history repeats itself. It repeats itself in terms of literal liberation movements. So I started to do research into past liberation movements and looked specifically into liberation theology, which was a movement led by largely Catholic priests in Latin America, who were using the Bible and other religious texts to bring about social change for people in Latin America. There was Black British feminism in the UK that I think one of the kind of interesting things semantically about Black British feminism was that the word within the context of that movement, Black stood for both people who we would call Black in the United States, but also Asian people. And there was this idea of Afro-Asian unity that often gets lost. I think I don't read about that happening in any other literature or movement, but I think it's interesting to consider. And then I also looked into the Algerian war for independence. And so in looking at all of those, right, it started to dawn on me that like liberation struggles are like kind of all the same, highly reductive, don't quote me on that, but that there's something to be gained from looking at liberation movements that have happened and seeing how they reflect on current movements. This has the effect, one, of kind of normalizing in a good way struggles for liberation, normalizing the chaos and conflicts that can come up in those struggles for liberation, normalizing the opposition that we can come to face in struggles for liberation, which I think can only be encouraging. And then on the left here, you're seeing a poem, which is from a series of poems that I wrote in response to works by Black video artists when I visited Video Data Bank at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago and Electronic Arts Intermix in New York. These are the only two video art distributors in the United States. And I went there specifically looking for artistic precedents for the kind of new media art I was seeing by a lot of amazing Black artists in my network. I sort of include Aileen in this, but you know, people who are technologists in a sense and really have a grasp of kind of contemporary technologies and how they play into social struggles. And it struck me through being at these databases that there's also this legacy of Black artists considering how technology can be either, you know, of benefit or detrimental, considering, you know, popular media and how Black people are portrayed in it. And one kind of desire that I have for the book is that it will illuminate that we're not starting from scratch. We're not starting from scratch in terms of social liberation movements. We're also not starting from scratch in terms of Black contemporary artists creating social critiques on technology. One sort of challenge or thorny question that always comes up when thinking about liberation movements is around violence, right? And I often think of this Stokely Carmichael essay, which I think is called The Pitfalls of White Liberalism, and which is essentially to say, like, white liberals are down for the cause until Black people start talking about arming themselves, and then there's a sort of knee-jerk, like violence is wrong kind of response, and sort of interrogating that. Funny side story, I taught that essay in a class, and one of my white male students was like, it sounds like he's saying we should be violent. And I was like, yeah. And he was like, I don't, he had exactly the response that the essay was about. So it's a very interesting thing. But so this question around, can violence be liberatory? When is violence condoned? A lot of these questions were debated when the UN was founded, and the sort of semantics around when those involved in wars, liberation wars, should be protected by international law and when they should be punished. And so sort of a way of deciding like whose violence and for what is permissible in the eyes of the international community. And it's a very, very fascinating thing. Obvious example is Palestine, but there are examples of this all over. And right, like I don't have to go into all the examples of certain people being allowed to be violent and others being not allowed to be violent. And more important though than like who is allowed or who isn't allowed is a sort of more fundamental question of can violence be liberatory? And if we say that, what are the sort of what are the implications of that? If we say that violence can be liberatory. And I personally think that if we look at an idea like healthy angering, which is very much a part of healing from trauma, we have to allow that in certain cases, a kind of violence is necessary for liberation. How am I doing on? I think I'm okay on time. One, I guess a downside of looking at history and seeing that things repeat themselves quite a bit is also that the newness that we can ascribe to either current day liberation movements or current artwork being done, that newness kind of is on shaky ground. It's not really as it's just not really the case sometimes that because work is being done with new tools that it is necessarily new. And Stuart Hall, I believe, talks about legacies being about, not about the repetition of a certain kind of image or a certain kind of aesthetic, but about a logic's in use, right? So even if it looks different, but it kind of functions the same way, it has the same sort of thrust, then it's not very new. And then we can't exactly call it avant-garde. The avant-garde is sort of a problematic term, or I don't know, actually. I'd love to talk about that with people. I had a conversation recently with someone who was talking about the avant-garde as being in itself a sort of problematic. But that's neither here nor there. I think my main point is that part of what I have seen is, especially now that there are more white run art spaces that are kind of sympathetic to the cause, there's been a sort of kind of tamping down of the volume of a lot of the kind of radical works that are being included there. And also I think a failure of arts criticism to kind of really illuminate the full complexity of work being created now, so that everything is being read through a kind of fairly straightforward social critique lens, right? Like the some of the work is enacting the same social critique, but also some of the work isn't, but is being interpreted as though it is. And both things, plus the fact that there are more white art spaces that are willing to kind of go out on a limb, has the potential to just kind of, yeah, dampen down the futuring work that's happening creatively. I think that this is my last slide. Yeah. So I actually just want to read the thing on the right, and this is from Hannah Black. I watched a video of the 1984 Kathleen Collins masterclass at Howard. She tells the students and me in her afterlife, if you look very carefully at the history of Black literature, to a large extent up to and including writers like Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, with few exceptions, it is the history of creating mythological or mythical Black people. Collins is passionately uninterested in the mythological. If you are the outsider, if you are the sinner, you are by definition extraordinary, meaning you are either super good or you are super evil. You are super sexual or you are super ascetic. You cannot arrive at normality because that is the one thing that has been denied about you. No one is going to mythologize my life. She believes in the normal and the human, and to sustain her belief, she ignores the mythological structure of both those concepts, normality and humanity. This destroyed me because I was reading as I was reading this, and then I was reading the Kathleen Collins, and I was agreeing with it. I was like, totally, you're either super this or you're super that. Like Black people can never just be normal, blah, 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 blah. And then just with like this one, I think one sentence at the end, she believes in the normal and the human, and to sustain her belief, she ignores the mythological structure of both those concepts, normality and humanity. That's something I would love to talk about with people, but it's this little passage from Hannah Black sort of destroyed normality for me as a goal. And so just as a last, the point that I'll end on is that as I talk about the sort of failure of cultural criticism to pick up on the complexities of contemporary art production, there's a way that there's no normalizing, or kind of normalizing there doesn't quite solve the problem either. And there's something else that we have to figure out in terms of understanding Black creative people as kind of both extraordinary and human and normal and more than normal. And so that's kind of all I have for y'all now. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing, and sending you positive energy as you work through and your body heals. Thank you for being here during working through that too. Like that's awesome. Thank you. If it's okay, would it be all right if you shared, Aileen, next?
Yes, I can go ahead and start. Let me share my screen. make sure that everyone can see this. Cool. So yeah, I'm an artist, curator, and writer. Much like I'm aware of many hats, and I've also had to contend with many disparate selves. For the last 7 or 8 years, I've curated exhibitions and created work and written about digital art and culture. So I'm just going to briefly share some illustrations that are a byproduct of that sort of peripatetic practice. So in this solo exhibition, which was titled New Contact, I was interested in looking at the intricacies and contradictions of human connection across networked space. I used installation and a lot of video composed of both found and original footage, which I do in much of my work. But I want to use those sort of found footage pieces and images to explore how image saturation affects our autonomy and our tactility. This subject was also the point of departure for this exhibition that I curated called To Feel What I Am. And in this exhibition, we sort of wanted to survey the power and failure of communication in a digital age. So that small sort of, well, that large-ish Tupperware in the middle had like a printout in the center that we were to replace every day, that it kind of like wore down throughout the day. It's not just an empty container. My book, Vanishing Acts, it sort of looks specifically at the role of network-based art practices as an aesthetic critique of increasingly seamless interfaces, technologies that are trying to become quieter and less noticeable to the point of actual disappearance with yeah, just things like voice user interfaces. That brings me to some more recent research I've been up to. I've been looking into like the graphic user interface, or GUI, which has proceeded to develop with this sort of imposed openness or directness that is kind of this quiet backdrop for all applications. It's this discrete surface where all data are kind of manipulated. But more specifically, I was looking at skeuomorphism, which is the term for design elements that derive references from an often analog original. I also looked into things like facial recognition and voice user interfaces as a form of skeuomorphs, since they are these forms of sort of mimicry, metaphorical mimicry that suggest human affect, temperament, humor, attentiveness. So this is an image from a solo exhibition of mine called Eyes Without a Face. And I sort of wrote and published an essay by the same title that traces our coevolution with skeuomorphism across various phases of interface design. This video in the middle here, it's hard to tell in the documentation, but there's actually a two-way mirror installed in the front of the video. So there were brief pauses in the playback where when the video screen goes black, it actually actively functions as a mirror and the viewer is implicated in the piece themselves. And this is on view right now in Vancouver, BC. These pieces, this is kind of a two-part video installation called Emotional Mechanics. And this was created by removing the polarizer filters from LCD screens. So polarizer filters are typically used to improve color and definition, allowing you to essentially see images on any LCD screen. So it's also obviously used in sunglasses, a lot of sort of lens technology. But when you use an LCD screen with the polarizer filter removed, it causes them to illuminate just like a singular bright white light. And then I guess like the reversed side of the polarizer filter that's removed, which you can see the viewer holding in their hand here, flips the color of the image that you're registering. There's another image of the video. So in 2016, I co-curated an exhibition for a traveling virtual reality exhibition. This museum is called DeModa, or the Digital Museum of Digital Art. And this museum is like, the exhibition itself is fully downloadable via Mac or PC, freed from any like physical constraints. It sort of allows you to create and exhibit work solely for the digital space, and that expands the possibilities there. And obviously you can take on different and unique forms and formats, such as this work by the artist Theo Tryon, which is a self-portrait viewed from the inside of his body. This is a visitor at the museum. And here is what the museum would sort of look like installed in person. This is in a gallery space in Paris. These are two images of works from an exhibition by American artist that I curated, and that exhibition was called Black Gooey Universe. And in that exhibition, the artist was really looking at technology as a racial exploration, and he and I were sort of simultaneously looking at the user interface in very different ways. So it was really interesting to engage with him on that. This is a still from an exhibition called While Removing the Garbage or Paying the Cleaner, in which both artists, Andre Magana and Cole Liu, were sort of exploring materials as mechanisms of resistance and means to interpret their respective intricacies of displacement. And then this was a project that manifested after my curatorial residency in Finland when travel was possible. It looks broadly at the concept of alienation and how users are alienated from one another at the expense of their devices. So broadly speaking, as an artist and writer and as a 9-to-5er, on top of all of that, I'm sort of interested in this idea of having like this complexity of range as a rejection of the predetermined career path towards like conventional success. I think that narrative really only supports one mode of genre participation for one kind of user. So I'm sort of actively fighting against that in both my practice and in my research into technology. In terms of taking up space, like I'd rather be fragmented, right? So yeah, I've also been thinking a lot about the idea of the hinterland, which is this area defined as being beyond a city or district. It's sort of by definition always beyond the visible. And so when I'm considering my experience, or just the Black experience in America, and immigrant experience in America, it can feel a bit like this, like a place where we go unseen or only feel seen within our sort of curated communities. So I've long been interested in this concept of being or existing beyond the visible, and in visualizing that experience through the work that I curate. So thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aileen. So there are a couple ways or a couple of directions that I thought it might make sense to go. But before I did that, I want to acknowledge that I had technological difficulties getting here. So what I'm going to do is try to make sure that we have enough time to actually have conversation. And I'm going to cut the thing I was going to do short in order to do that. And also because honestly, I'm geeking out having you both here. And I want to engage with both of you. So I'm going to do something really quick, and then I'm going to kind of enter into what hopefully becomes a more organic conversation based on some of the stuff that the work that I know of you, that you shared in this space here, but also the type of work I've seen outside of the space from both of you, the conversations that you've had, the panels that you've been on outside before that you alluded to on, and also some of the work in Blackspace and other spaces like that too. So my contribution here before we get started into that conversation is something that I made or wrote after the 2017 election. And we're talking about like music and protest and talking about how we create art that responds to a specific moment, but also that acts as a form of resistance and rebellion in some ways too. I'm going to share a minute of it. I'm going to sing it, and then we're going to start. If that's okay, if that's cool. So I was struck when I went there afterwards. This was during the Women's March in 2017. And I said to myself, I'm going to make something because I don't want to ever forget both this feeling and the reality that we're in at this moment. So here it is. I'm going to close my eyes because I'm nervous. All right. After the march dies down and the signs are cast away, after the pink hats crowd in round the monumental choice we've made, giving hope 1,000 chances, spitting change into the wind, trying to find a place for standing, but the sitting power won't remit. This is what democracy looks like. Is this what democracy looks like? Anxious hippies raging on a corner, every dream in line and marching for us. When the way is clear and there's no peace inside, can't let the lies divide us. We know the truth inside us, and we gotta keep on praying on. Yeah. Okay, that's it. I think part of the reason why I did that is because I wanted to contribute to what both of you have already contributed to me in a lot of ways in your work, but also starting the conversation about technologically mediated connection that you both bring up in your work, and that you both kind of not only interrogate, but you sit with and work through in your work. So both of you in your work invites audience to sit with some of the relationships we develop through and with technology, particularly in ways that thicken the links between technologically mediated identity, between the various presences that we piece together in online spaces, and the mundane, everyday research that you say on in Blackspace we do to create art that lives and speaks, right? While I'm tempted to ask both of you a general question about how you think of some of the norms we've adopted during this time of hyper-technologized communication, and how that might inform the ways that we create, curate, and consume, I think we might get to that question, but I want to let that kind of linger in the background as kind of like a, mood music for a more specific question. So this specific question is actually built on that panel that you both participated in, that was based on Black curation rather, in the before times in 2019. I hope not, An. I hope it can't be. So you were both in that panel, and it was about insiders and outsiders in the art world. right? And I know you pick up on this conversation in Blackspace when discussing the dehumanizing language of the Black body. So the question is, after all that buildup, I wonder what the past year has brought into focus about this insider-outsider reality. And if we're any closer now to imagining a different relation that might make room for naughtiness, as you said, I think during that panel, in practice, for centering Black contemporary art in our futures. Does that question make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I have to think about it for a second. One place I might start, and it's not a complete answer to your question at all, but I've been struck by, for me, how much I've always loved phone calls, but there was a study published about how phone calls can feel more intimate than Zoom calls, because what creates the feeling of intimacy is real-time social cues. And so, you know, if we're like a phone call without an image, if the phone call is like good quality, can sometimes feel like a little more connected than like if you got a Zoom call and you're like, internet is bad, and you're like, what did you say? You know, like then we kind of like can struggle to connect. And obviously not everyone feels like that, but just that idea started me thinking on like, what is intimacy, and how is it created? And as a millennial who loves to text, and who, like, I have several relationships that are like very text-based that feel quite intimate, I wonder about how intimacy is not just technologically mediated, but like culturally mediated. Like what we understand as intimacy, how we describe it, how we define it to each other. I think that this generation is seen to be like the most lonely generation. But also a lot of those studies are not coming from our generation. So I don't know, I'm interested in that. Again, just a partial response.
Yeah, I have some thoughts, and I don't know how clearly they'll come out because there's a bunch of them. But in regards to the last year, and thinking a lot about, wellness at large, like what it means to be well, what it means to be unwell, the corporatization of wellness, the rise of the sort of meditation app, and a lot of the biometrics that are coming out of this moment. I watched obviously like the keynote from Apple as they expressed all of the new features of the Apple Watch that could kind of like tell you when your blood oxygen levels are a little too high. And it was really freaky. They sort of like suggested that like, in some sense it suggested like this device could save your life, but there's an ominous sort of reactionary tone to that message as well. They had a lot of sort of like, oh, I thought I just fell and my watch told me that I needed to go to the hospital. And anyways, all that to say, I think a lot, or I worry a lot about the techno-optimism behind that sort of thinking, and the sort of lack of access, or who gets left behind. What sort of dystopian futures are we like heading towards, and what people are like actually in effect living in those futures now because they don't have access to these sort of connected devices.
Yeah, that reminds me of a couple of things about this idea of access. And it struck me the language that you use, Aileen, about the interfaces becoming more and more quiet in the background, and more invisibilized in some ways. And also, I guess, if we're going to use the word, naturalized, in the ways that we relate to each other. I mean, we are literally talking to each other through Zoom, but not to say that, you know, the phone wasn't a technology in and of itself too, but it seemed to be a different one in some ways. It strikes me too, to connect in some ways to what you were saying about the language of the 9 to 5, like kind of putting together pieces of who we are and the spaces that we make for, or at least in the space that we normalize for certain types of production, whether they're creative production or scholarly production, in the space that we don't leave for people who have work in different places, right? Aileen, you were talking about being a person who was an artist, a writer, and a 9 to 5er. And I know a lot for people who are in the audience. There's some people who are in the audience from the class I teach, and a lot of them are what some people would call "quote unquote" non-traditional students who are working while that's happening. So I think it can be difficult for us to kind of navigate the ways that technology kind of makes us forget those distinctions. I think too, in Blackspace, I think there were a couple of conversations that happened that stuck with me, where there was one conversation in that portion of the essay, "My Virtual Pussy, My Artificial Lungs," right? Where Juliana Huxtable writes, "In our current time when tech upgrades have happened continually and visibly, technology often gets equated with flexibility, the ability to move, seek, and transform, but technology's role," you write, "as Huxtable imagines, it is the established static identities." And you know, you quote the refrain from "Never Break the Shape" from Perfume Genius, which is genius in and of itself, but like from that song "Slip Away." But I'm interested in the ways that we have static identities because of technologies, and who creates those identities and when they're created for us, and we have to operate through them. So I'm wondering if, in some ways, we could talk about, I guess, both technologies, but also this mundane ways that technologies interact with our life, and also the ways that mundanity is expressed in what Martine Sims, I guess, calls mundane Afrofuturisms, or the mundane Afrofutures. My question for both of you, and you could take it wherever it is that you want, I guess, how we express those mundanities in the art that we create. I know, Aileen, you were talking about user interfaces, right? And the things that become mundane. And you mentioned social media and the types of ways that we create different portions of ourself in order to realize a self that we want to be as a form of mundane. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Aileen, what do you know about like cybersecurity?
Not a ton, to be honest.
It's just that's like a particular area that I've been interested in because it feels really mundane, like everyone kind of needs to know it, but
right.
I know some artists who like I feel like Salome knows a lot about cybersecurity and American, I think, but ignore what I just said.
Thinking a little bit about Clayton's question, my mind went back to the moment when An was speaking about the destruction of normalcy, and my ears kind of perked up because it's just like we are delivered these just sort of very predetermined navigational systems, and we interact with them all day, every day. I think more so now, post-pandemic, than prior. Our devices have kind of become both our personal assistants and also like our best friends and our way to access our best friends and our families and everything like that. So I think that that actually gives you an incredible amount of power when you're a tech company or a just like patenting person, going back to cybersecurity in a way. I think a lot about how like even the gestures that we motion as we are using our devices are patented. So they're actually like down to your hand movements, like kind of directing. Yeah, just the ways that we move.
Yeah.
And how the
Yeah,
destruction of normalcy could maybe look like, I don't know, just creating an app that does not function somehow or disregards the sort of like rules that are required for approval.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about what you said about vanishing technologies, and that struck me as a place where the normal is like they vanish because they like blend so much into our normal every day. And so it's a place where the normal actually starts to become kind of scary or being used against someone. And so yeah, what you're saying about like an app that like doesn't function normally or something, or like as a way of like interrupting, or like, and you also talked about like facial recognition, and what's the word that you were saying that where the kind of
Oh,
emoji,
skeuomorphs. Yeah,
say it again.
skeuomorphs.
Skeuomorphs.
Mhm.
Like I guess I think about how intimate my phone is with my face.
Totally.
Yeah. And like there's something, I don't know, obviously the first time I saw Face ID, there was something like very sci-fi about it, and then the novelty of it like quickly wears off, you know, if you do it.
Mhm.
And that's part of that too, I feel like.
Yeah, that's part of the sort of normalization of it. And I feel like it's become almost less and less frequent, those moments of sort of novelty or quote unquote magic that you experience with technology as we accept each new wave. Like we're kind of like unbothered now. We're just like unimpressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, I thought about that too. So I, at this point, have insomnia because of the blue light from the phones, but also because, you know, the world. But I think it's interesting too to think about the ways that some of these technologies disrupt the patterns, whether good or bad, that we, I guess, have grown used to. And also can maybe in some ways be used for liberation. I know. So one of the things that in preparation for this talk, but also in conversation with folks in the class that I teach, has been about how we construct freedom and how we construct liberation. And we were reading a short story by N.K. Jemisin, and it was about this idea that, you know, you have this voice in your head that continuously tells you and mediates the world around you, right? Where you can't necessarily understand it from the perspective of your embodied presence, but it's through like what the net and what all these digital spaces are trying to get you to see or understand. and what it means to get outside of that, and if that's at this point possible. But also, in relationship to that, we were looking at recently looking at Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer, and thinking about the ways that memories are erased. So on the other side of that, like whether freedom is being away from the deluge of information, or if freedom as constructed in that text is not having a memory of the past things, you know? So these problematic representations of what freedom are and could be. I guess one of the questions I have for both of you as we talk about Afrofutures is how you see this freedom, or at least struggle for freedom, manifesting, not only today, but in the work that you see coming out. I know that both of you are curators, and in a lot of ways you get to kind of see these patterns forming in the work that people create, you know? I do wonder what you notice in response to not only to the moment, but to that hope for people going forward in the moment, and the work that they want to provide for a world.
You want to start, Aileen?
A lot of good thoughts there, Clayton. Just to kind of start with the first half of your question, thinking about ways to liberate, self-liberate from these sort of normalized technologies. I think there has been a lot of conversation both in the curatorial realm and then also just in digital conversations, online communities about like glitches, obviously, as a way to become more obvious. It's like the obverse of the seamlessness and the disappearance of technology is the rupture, the point at which you are reminded that this is a device, right? That it is not a seamless sort of part of your everyday interaction, that someone designed this. And in order to kind of achieve that, to make obvious the design is to sort of deconstruct it, right? So that's one thing that I think has been in a lot of conversations, both curatorially and in a lot of artistic practices. And I think that has a lot to do with this impulse of assertion, right? You have to assert, you have to insert yourself into these sort of spaces that were for a long time very unwelcoming and maybe still are in some form, and sort of also create your own spaces.
Yeah, something that comes up for me is like both the power of going back to like static identities on the internet, that it can be both beneficial to have that, to assert that as a way of kind of expressing a self that hasn't yet been expressed. And, you know, in that situation, the sort of stream of information that you're talking about, Clayton, can be like a boon if, you know, in and amidst that information, you're able to pick and choose the things that help sort of buoy your sense of self. And I actually think that like piecing together of oneself from digital artifacts can be very moving and life-changing. And at the same time, it would also seem to be necessary to, as Aileen is saying, to enter this process of deconstruction and to see the ways in which the the technologies that we might be using to assert identities are themselves designed by people with culturally situated values and biases and things like that. But it doesn't, I feel like both things have to happen, the construction and the deconstruction. And for that process to be kind of complete. Yeah, stop there.
So we have one question from the audience, and I do want to make sure that we get to at least a couple, and then I have a couple of other ones, but one of the members of the audience asked if Aileen can talk a little bit more about her exhibition Songwriter, the critique presented in the work that by putting an external film or layer against an all-white screen, the viewer was able to see it. And the question revolves around what the film or layer represents and how we are constructed to see.
So Songwriter is not an exhibition, actually. It's a singular piece. And I think that one was shown at Cooper Cole. So I was thinking again about the sort of level of seamlessness and invisibility within the screens that we often interact with. I'm not sure how many of it have actually been able to experience this sort of like act of viewing the moving images within the polarizer filter, but it is actually, as I was speaking about earlier, how like few and far between these like moments of novelty in our engagement with technology are. When I did it for the first time, I was like, whoa, this is like I'm holding the video. It's really disembodying. Yeah, in the work Songwriter, I used that technology again, and that piece actually has a lot more to do with just in terms of like the video pieces that I kind of cut together, both found and original footage. That work itself has a lot more to do with immigration and seeing and being seen within these sort of disparate communities. I'm not sure if that fully answered the question, but I did want to elaborate a little bit more about the work.
Building on that, like seeing and being seen in disparate communities, it reminded me again of where you talked about being a person who is in 9 to 5, and some of the assumptions that might be made about, again, that conversation about insiders and outsiders, right? Like the assumptions about who gets to show up in a particular space, and the types of support structures and language that they're familiar with, based on the experiences that they've had. And part of the reason why I think about that is because there was a recent study that just got published about academic spaces in particular, right? Where I think 25% of the people who are like PhDs who are connected to it have had parents who are PhDs. 50% have had parents who had some form of connection to, whether they went to graduate school or something like that. And I think about the layered connections and the types of expectations and assumptions about presence that exist both in the academic world and in the art world and in the ways that they intersect too. And I wonder if you being Aileen and An could talk a bit about what types of experiences that you've had, if you want to share, about like non-traditional pathways of getting into your art or getting into academic spaces, both because, again, I mentioned that there are people in the audience who might be taking a similar path, but also because I imagine that if I were to say that that is a future that we need, that would be one of them, from my perspective, at least.
appreciate that question. I'm a big fan of thinking about alternative education and alternate pathways into like creative professions. I initially went to art school and dropped out of art school, worked for some artists for some time. And then when I went back to college, I kind of did a lot of anthropology and other social sciences before ultimately finding my way into poetry. And because I had taken all of those different detours along the way, I think that the advice that I was always getting at like every point, and advice that I still get to this day, is that I need to focus. And it's advice that I'll never take. And in particular, because like as I kind of stubbornly cling to being someone with several practices, I find that the opportunities that come to me are like suited specifically for my particular set of interests, and that wouldn't happen otherwise. And that there are sort of academic spaces that are kind of tailored to my set of interests, but they kind of had to find me rather than me find them. And the one sort of problem with that approach is, I think, it relies on a sort of privilege to loaf for a while and to not focus, right? Like part of focusing is becoming economically viable and legible in a job market. And if you have the ability to not to kind of delay that process, there can be a benefit to that, but a lot of people don't have that sort of privilege. I guess the last thing I sort of think about is the power of communities to enable some of this kind of alternate pathway. If you at least see that what you are striving after is being mirrored back to you as positive in the community that you're part of, then that in itself is a great benefit. And it might mean having to start a community that doesn't exist. So I often talk with people about like how to start communities that aren't there, or at least empower people to start to move in that direction.
Strangely, I kind of, the point that you made during your talk on about whether or not avant-garde is a problematic term is like coming back to mind for me with respect to this question, because avant-garde is French, but like the origin of the meaning is like a military term for like advanced guard, right? The person who, the part of the army or like the military guard that like is isolated because they move forward ahead of the rest of the group. And I think that that sort of thinking is very much mirrored in the romanticized thinking of like this isolated artist, like alone in their studio, drinking heavily. I do think that there are like a lot of predetermined, again, like modes of thinking about this mode of genre participation in the art world that simply don't satisfy like a number of different paths and communities and ways to forge forward in the future that do open up spaces that allow for more Black artists and more diverse ideas to come to the fore. In my experience in particular, you know, I am the first person in my family to have gone to college, and I mean, well, besides my sister, like undergrad, but then also pursue a graduate degree. And as an immigrant, I think that there are lots of other conversations to be had about, you know, the stability complex that occurs there, and just different modes of thinking about, like, yeah, again, like economic viability. So yeah, I'm really glad that you asked that, Clayton.
Yeah.
There's another question. But before I get there, I want to, part of the reason why I asked that question is because I identify as also as a person who was one of the first in my family to go to graduate school, who was like, you know, first gen student, but also some of the economic precarity that we don't necessarily talk about that's associated with that when you don't have a support structure for finances and a whole bunch of other stuff kind of get swept under the rug. And it can act as a thing that keeps you on from, not you specifically on, but people in general from focusing, as you said. Whether, I mean, sometimes focus is not necessarily the best thing. Sometimes focus puts blinders on your side so you can't necessarily see the world in ways that you need to. And I think too, that leads me to a question of how your experiences have shaped your practice, right? Like, so your curatorial practice. And this gets to a question that was raised, asking if both of you can speak to your practice and its relation to producing an archive of practices for freedom. Particularly on, you said that you were devastated by Hannah Black's response to Kathleen Collins' masterclass at Harvard. The normal, the human are complex, of course, and there are different mythologies that construct our thinking about those constructs in this digital age. So I wonder if you could speak to that, if there's anything that you thought you might want to say about that, both of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the main desires I have is just to build a sense of creative continuity between artists that I am engaging with in my curatorial and arts administrative practice, and artists who you know, were creating in the 60s and 70s as a way of like bolstering even more the sense of community and that kind of mirroring back that I was just talking about, and making okay, again, maybe normalizing certain you know, career choices or creative choices, and also as like a sense of inspiration, right? Like I think the archive is there to be a safe hold, but it's also there as a point of inspiration, and so yeah, I'm very interested in like archiving and documentation, documentary poetics, and the sort of ethics of documenting ways that the person documenting necessarily inserts themselves into the process of creating an archive. It's sort of like an endlessly fascinating topic to me. And I think that the process of archiving is mirrored by the process of curating, in a sense, right? It's like the sort of like choosing and culling and most importantly creating a framework around a series of artifacts in order to make some kind of statement about you know, a body of works.
It's actually a really lovely transition, thinking about archives. I'm very aware of this sort of interest that I have, or obsession, you could call it, with like interface technologies and like the ways that we communicate via networks, kind of branching off of this, I guess just my upbringing. My parents met as pen pals, and their letters back and forth to one another over the period of like a number of years before they ever met in person, just a generation ago, you know, like these physical kind of like almost ethereal things now that are in a sense an archive. Really, to me, I think of them as like a story that exists prior to this time of very much performed subjectivity that we exist in now. And so both in my own art and my curatorial practice, I think I'm constantly sort of trying to like dig at that and piece together like what is lost and what words even maybe take on a different meaning now than they did back then. Something like, you know, missing or longing or yearning, and these terms that we think they mean the same thing today, but I think it's like just not possible that they do, and that these technologies are fundamentally sort of like changing our experience of these things and our relationship to these things.
A language as an archive, I feel like, thank you for saying that, Aileen, because I feel like, yeah, the way that we use certain words changes over time and becomes like a repository of cultural values. Like that's how discourse studies happens. And it's like a super fascinating field to me.
So I will say, as a completely transparent thing, I feel like this is just warming up and we've had a really good conversation and I want to keep going. And I know that in terms of time, I want to talk more, of course, about Blackspace on the Poetics of Afrofuture and Vanishing Acts as well. And also the playlist, of course, the songs that are there too. So I'll also say too that part of the contribution that I wanted to add to the conversation was the music, and I know that you talked about this in part of your presentation on when you were mentioning Nathaniel Mackey's work, but also in the idea that music infuses some of the rhythm and the thing, how I read your work too, your poetry. And we see this too in discussions from Fred Moten and a few others about the ways that music kind of influence how you hear and how you feel. That and I wanted the playlist to do that. There's music in there from things that you referenced in Blackspace. There are songs in there, there are artists in there from that. But there are also artists who got me thinking, or at least connected me to the work that both of you've done rather. There's some work in there from Moses Sumney and this song about multiplicity and this song about, you know, kind of having the and be the beginning and the end part, right? Like always as a connection to things that could also come and not necessarily being static. And I think in this conversation about the Black avant-garde, however problematic it is, like also connected to Afrofuturism, once it becomes static, it dies in some ways, right? Like it's not something that, it's often difficult to define because it's constantly moving and changing and shifting. So I guess in the time that we have, which I guess is none, it's 8 o'clock at this point, I want to wrap it up by asking a quick question. Like, and in Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategies, she makes the assertion, and we've talked about this in the class that I teach a bit, that in our lives, we should try, if we have places where we can have conversations with people, if we get in the room together, we should try to find that conversation that only the people in the room can have and have it. So I guess my final statement is, are there questions that you wish to ask or things that you wish to leave us with?
The thing that comes to mind for me, I love that quote, is that it's important for me to always be learning from my peers and to be really open about who it is I'm learning from. And my current, the director at Recess, where I work, was talking about mentorship. People often think about it as between like someone who knows more and someone who knows less, but that a kind of mentorship relationship can transpire between any two people who want that and can be bidirectional. And so for me, I think, you know, like someone like Aileen and like you, Clayton, like interactions where I can kind of hear you speak are always illuminating for me, and I would say that's part of my practice, in the same way that because I'm a poet, reading has to be part of my practice. So that's kind of what I will end on.
Thank you,
Thank you, Aileen.
Okay, so I think we are at 8 o'clock, or at least over 8 o'clock at this point. I want to thank An and Aileen for joining us, for the audience members for being in this Zoom space with all of us. I hope that you get a chance to enjoy your respective weekends, that you get some rest and relaxation. An, I hope your body heals wonderfully and beautifully, as your soul is wonderful and beautiful. And thank you all so much for being in this space.
That voice, man. That voice is fantastic. It was like